swearing in or roll call first?
I'm going to call the meeting to order first.
Okay.
The meeting of the Ventura County Air Pollution Control District Hearing Board for November the 16th, 2009 is called to order, and the time is 5:31 p.m. Before we continue with the existing agenda, I'd like to ask the Madam Clerk to do a swearing in of one of our hearing board members, please.
Mr. Murphy, if you'll repeat after me, saying your name and place. I, Dan Murphy, do solemnly swear or affirm
Do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of California against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
and the Constitution of the State of California against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California,
that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion,
that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties upon which I am about to enter.
You are sworn in.
Thank you.
Welcome to the hearing board, Mr. Murphy. I'm sure you're familiar with the proceedings. Okay, item 2 on the agenda. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Stephen Hurlock,
Present.
Mr. Stubblefield,
Present.
Mr. Murphy,
Present.
Mr. Gasparino.
Here. Please note that we have a quorum, so we will continue. Before you have our agenda, but I understand that Vintage has a presentation to give us and an overview. And so, Madam Clerk, yeah, I was going to do the swearing in of the. So, Madam Clerk, would you please do the swearing in?
Can you make sure your mic is turned on? You and each of you do solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give in the matters now pending before this board will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Yes. All right, thank you very much. Tonight we're hearing petition number 824, the petition of Vintage Production California LLC for a regular variance from District Rule 29.C, conditions on permits, violation of permit conditions in District Rule 71.1, crude oil production and separation, Section B1. Requirements are for storage tanks, and Section C1, requirements produced gas for Title V Federal Operating Permit number 04. I'd like to ask if there's anybody in the audience, the public, that will be speaking tonight. Okay, please note for the record there is nobody from the public representing and speaking tonight on this particular petition. At this point, I'd like to ask that the Vintage production folks, the representatives that were sworn in, please state your name and please go ahead with your information presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, board members, district, county council, and clerk of the board. My name is James Lovins. I'm Senior Environmental Advisor for Vintage Production California, LLC. Vintage has been operating 2 unpermitted flares under an emergency variance and subsequent interim variance due to the fact that our major gas line that carries produced natural gas with high levels of CO2 has been taken out of service due to a leak. We are still in the process of getting ready to repair that line, and Mr. Kern Hankins, our facilities lead, will get into the details of where exactly we are on the timeline and milestones. To date, we have curtailed gas production, initially 7 to 10% to cut down on the flaring. Since the interim variance hearing, I believe on September 29th, I believe it was, we've curtailed further, and the percentage now ranges between 15 and 20% of gas being flared curtailed. We're asking for continuation of the variance period by having the regular variance granted until the date noted in the variance petition for the regular variance, which I believe is February 22nd. Entertain questions from the board.
Does the other person that was sworn in have anything to add at this particular point in time?
I will. My name is Kern Hankins. I'm the lead facility engineer for Vintage. I function as the facilities manager. I'll turn it back to Jim to talk about in general, what is the status of the facilities, and I'm prepared to give you an update of the construction, and we've provided a schedule, and I'll go through that in some detail.
Okay. Board members, questions, please.
At this point, I'd like to ask the board if they have any questions or comments for the petitioner. Mr. Herlock. I'm sorry, Mr. Stubblefield.
In the documentation that we received from the district tonight, the district made the statement that it's requested that Vintage look for ways to further reduce flaring until the alternate pipeline can be placed in service. Could you outline what those steps have been thus far?
Yes, Mr. Stubblefield. To date, the gas side of well casings of wells that have been either shut in due to mechanical reasons or have been awaiting repair have been closed in, which stops the amount of gas going from those wells to the flare. And any well that has gone down and has been repaired, I believe has not been, at least the gas casing portion of it has not been turned on, so that further reduces the amount of gas. I might add that at the interim hearing I mentioned that there was quite possibly a concurrent project going on at the HAMP facility where compressors were hopefully to be taken out of service. 4 of the 5 compressors have been taken out of service as of this date, and we're projecting that the 5th and final compressor there will be taken out of service also. It's an unrelated project, but it just happened to occur concurrently with this flaring, so those emissions will be essentially turned off.
Thank you.
Mr. Murphy.
I actually have quite a few questions, and it's not due to the difficulty of this particular instance. It's just, I'm a new guy on the block. This is my first meeting. I don't particularly know the industry, and so I just would like to find out a little bit about how this all works and the precautions and everything about this. How is the leak? You mentioned the leak was detected. Somebody smelled it. How was it detected?
Memory serves me correctly, on, I believe it was Sunday, July 19th. Oh, I have mine on. Are you getting me?
Mine wasn't on.
Oh. Mr. Murphy, I believe, if I remember correctly, on July 19th, which was during a weekend, our gas line suffered a failure. Vintage personnel responded and discovered that the main gas line that was carrying our CO2 gas, which mainly comes from the Ojai and Silver Thread lease, had suffered a failure.
How do you discover that?
The failure at this point in time was discovered because gas had come up through the pavement of a roadway entrance to several homes.
And they were smelling it.
Actually, I believe we were notified by the newspaper because the delivery person of the Sunday edition couldn't get to the houses to deliver, and a phone call was made.
Okay. How old is the gas line that failed?
Mr. Hankins?
Yeah, I can answer that. The gas line that failed was constructed in the 1950s, the late 1950s, by one of the major oil companies, and then has transferred ownership several times since then.
Do you then have a program for replacement, or do you just do corrosion testing periodically? What is some program so that that these don't fail?
And that's a very good question. And I can answer it in general. All pipelines are subject to various types of evaluation, scrutiny, and ongoing maintenance. There are engineering evaluations of all pipelines. The most critical pipelines tend to be regulated pipelines. This particular pipeline that we're talking about is a gas gathering pipeline that is jurisdictional, has oversight by the government Department of Transportation under the PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Material Agency. So the pipeline has various evaluations and maintenance that are prescriptive by the federal government. One of those is engineering evaluation. So,
what does that mean?
We determine the thickness. This is a steel pipeline. We determine the thickness of the pipeline, not as actually built, but the thickness of the pipeline that we can evaluate from measurements. And that thickness, then we do engineering calculations based on the known properties of the pipe, and that's how we determine the maximum pressure containment of that pipe. This is relevant because going on this discussion, after the leak was discovered, we evaluated the mechanism of the leak, determined that it was a legacy, unknown age internal corrosion mechanism. We clamped, if you will, put an external clamp with a weld repair on it. That's a permanent repair. That meets the definition of a permanent repair of the pipeline. And we additionally did thickness measurements of the representative piece of pipeline. This is a buried pipeline, so we did ultrasonic thickness measurements to determine what is the representative thickness of the pipe remaining. Then we, as part of this leak, we had to reevaluate what is the maximum allowable working pressure of the pipeline. Based on the internal thickness that we discovered, we determined that the pipeline had to be derated to a lower allowable pressure. And so that's what we did. We put the pipe back in service, but at a lower allowable pressure in accordance with the regulations. That lower allowable pressure is what made us no longer able to feed that gas into our gas plant at an acceptable pressure. And so until we're able to replace that pipeline with a higher maximum allowable pressure pipeline, that's where we're in the flaring in Ojai and Silver Thread, and having the CO2 removal plant shut down.
Yeah. In the presentation by the board, it said that the pipeline had been tested for corrosion. How often do you do that? When was it? How long it had been before the leak that this had occurred?
There are a number of tests that are required. We have cathodic protection on the pipeline, and the cathodic protection has to be inspected on a periodic basis. I think it's quarterly. I'm not sure exactly what the frequency for external cathodic protection inspection is. In addition, the pipeline operators have to check the right-of-way of the pipeline, including driving the right-of-way, looking for excavation projects and unauthorized or other projects that might damage the pipeline through striking it. There are periodic leak detections using sophisticated electronic instrumentation that is required on a periodic basis. And from a frequency standpoint, for this pipeline, it is DOT jurisdictional, so a lot of the frequencies are prescriptive, and it's rather complex. I don't have the actual frequency in front of me. We're fully compliant. We're compliant with the inspection frequencies. The issue really comes out that this is an old pipeline, and the project that we're proceeding with is to use some new technology to install a new pipeline that will have predictive mechanical integrity going forward that is associated with a new product now.
Okay. It just concerns me a little bit that we get to the stage where you have the pipe that corrodes, leaks, and then when you get and test it, you say, oh well, the whole pipeline really didn't have the integrity to carry the amount of pressure that we had. But so are the testing that you do, that the jurisdictions impose upon you, you do think those are adequate, and that this was just the abnormality that occurred right here in this particular corrosive leak?
Well, we can't argue with the leak failure mechanism that we found. It was a in industry, it's a catastrophic failure of the pipeline, and we evaluated that failure, and our response in order to put that particular pipeline back in service, our evaluation was we can put it back in service, derating it to 50% of the pressure that it was previously containing. So in operational terms, that's a drastic reaction on our part, which we're now back. I'm not interested.
I'm sure that you're doing the right thing. Sounds like you're doing the right thing. What I'm wondering about is jurisdictionally, the fact that this was able to occur in the first place without the testing showing that there was a possibility of this occurring.
And it is a pipeline that was built in the 1950s, okay. And so really that's why, from a go-forward standpoint, our effort now is to replace that pipeline operationally with a new line.
Okay, to a different area, this is on flaring that, and this is just my lack of understanding of the industry, that if there would have been flares that had been constructed previously, then you do have flares at some places, but you didn't have here, then you would have had a mechanism and you wouldn't have had a violation. Is that correct?
The flares in question at Ojai and Silver Thread were initially put in as emergency only, and the district for emergency flares allows us to operate them for a 24-hour emergency period. Then we have to seek a variance protection to continue beyond that
I
period.
understand that. Flares what are they? Are they just pipes that you drive by and you see a flare? It looks like it's pipe coming out that somebody lights the top of. Is it more complicated than that? Am I showing my ignorance?
No. It's a good question. All flares are basically just a pipe that's been lit for all intents and purposes.
Yeah. Well, then why don't you have them already in place? So under the authority, maybe this is to be directed towards the district questioning. When you construct these things in the first place, just have them there. You light them, and then if they're already in place, you wouldn't have to have a violation.
I'd actually like to address that because we do, of course, have permitted flares associated with the process. However, the permitted flare that historically has been used for a long time to handle upsets from Ojai and Silver Thread leases, the permanent flare is located at the CO2 plant. Because the pipeline that connected the two was severed, that's why we're unable to use the permitted flare that is designated for that gas.
So essentially, you aren't anticipating you're going to have something, so you do have flare capabilities. It was just wrongly located for what actually occurred.
That is correct.
Another thing, again, having probably nothing to do with this particular thing, but when I see a flare going, it seems to me, gee, what a waste of all that energy. And I'm looking at this where it says you're flaring off, and losing $5,000 some a day just in the flaring. Is there something that you can do to capture and make a generator and get that where it isn't a waste? Or is that technically feasible? Or again, am I showing my ignorance?
Operationally,
Yep.
the existing equipment we have at our facilities, there's no way to utilize the excess produced gas.
But I mean, could there be, like emergency generators that would be deal? You put stuff, you add electricity to the grid. It just seems like such a waste.
That is the possibility for I guess I'd have to defer to the APCD regarding what it would take to permit something that would burn that much gas at this point in time.
Okay. And you've got dollar figures about revenue losses if you had to shut down of approximately $130,000 a day. You're essentially mining gas and oil type of here. So if you close off, you're going to have some expense, etc. but you aren't, that oil is still there to be utilized as a later time, so are you just, is it that much of a loss, or are you just deferring your revenue to a later time?
Excuse me for just a moment.
I'll try this one, because from a go-forward economic standpoint, it's crippling to an oil field to shut down your wells.
What does that mean?
Once you stop a well producing, you will never get the oil production back to that same level. It's just because of subsurface wellbore damage. And if you think about it, a well is subsurface because of what's happening at the interface between, downhole between the pump and the sand face. When you stop that oil and gas flowing in, it wants to be flowing in at a steady state. When you stop that, you can't expect to ever achieve those same results again. Sand flows in. You have wellbore damage. So it's so if you shut down a well for some indeterminate amount of time and turn it back on, you may get some production. You may lose the well entirely. So from a reservoir standpoint, shutting down the production is oil production loss. Certainly from a employee standpoint, we have employees that are working day to day in these fields, and shutting in a field is of course can be devastating to the employees. From a just stepping back even further, these are oil fields, and the oil production is where the value is. Just and it's hard to say that natural gas is undervalued, but from an energy content, natural gas is undervalued. This is associated gas. These aren't gas wells. All the gas wells are shut in.
When you say it's undervalued, what do you mean?
From a heat content, the value of the heat content in oil is worth several times that of the heat content in natural gas. Meaning
oil is more expensive for the BTUs or whatever you get than gas.
That's a fair way to say it. And these are oil wells that the gas stream, while the gas stream does have some value, these oil wells are being produced for the value of the liquid oil. And as a practical matter, a lot of fields like this will produce the gas and process the gas and extract the liquids from the gas and sell the gas, if you will, at a loss, because you don't want to flare the gas. We're not permitted to flare the gas on an ongoing basis, but it's associated gas that a byproduct of producing that oil is you have to produce the gas. It's typically in these sort of fields, it's not technically attractive or economic to re-inject the gas. It's a much better deal for all to process that gas, bring it to a gas plant similar to what we operate in Shields Canyon and Torrey Canyon, extract the liquids, sell the propanes, and sell the natural gas. Which is certainly that's where we were steady state before the pipeline failed. That is the best case. However, when you sever that pipeline moving the gas, such as happened, I guess I go back to, it would be, in our documents, it would be very devastating to the oil production from the field to shut that in.
I think the rest of my questions have to go to the district, and you're going to have some presentation. Right?
Any other questions of the board at this time for the petitioner?
Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Herlock?
Get that. I have a couple of questions. We talked about this a little bit in September, but there are a number of gas lines involved in. Do you have the draft order that we're all looking at?
Yes.
Okay. On page 3, there's in the second paragraph. There's the 8-inch gas line. Top of the second paragraph on page 3, and on page 4, under 72609, there's the B line. And on page 5 at the very top, there's the Unocal line. Could you remind me, how these are related to each other, if they are, and how they play into your project and the problems, and kind of clarify. And I know you gave us a handout that has a photograph in it, and if you want to use that, that would be fine too. But I'd like to understand whether these are 3 distinct lines and how they're related and what you're doing to them and so forth.
Okay, I apologize for the confusion with pipelines. Relevant to this discussion, there are only 2 pipelines. One is in service and one is not. So the first reference you had at page 3, where the second paragraph, we refer to an 8-inch gas line that ruptured and started leaking. That is the same pipeline that is mentioned in page 4, where we talk about the B line. Same pipeline.
So Vintage's 8-inch gas line is exactly equal to the B line?
It's a name. Yep, the B line is the name for the 8-inch gas line that ruptured, that was repaired and was returned to service. And then and that line is presently in service.
In service at 100 psi?
Correct. Yes. And the other pipeline that we're talking about that we refer to as the Unocal line, it runs roughly parallel, has been out of service since about 2003, and is the pipeline that we are presently working to rehabilitate. And that's the rehabilitation schedule project that I attached as Exhibit 2 to give you an update on how is that pipeline rehabilitation project going forward.
So there are 2 pipelines really involved in your petition, and those are the B line and the Unocal line.
That's correct. Yeah.
Where do they come from and where do they go?
They both pipelines run parallel from a location on South Mountain Road, and they run about almost 10 miles along South Mountain Road through the community of Bardesdale and to the entrance of our Shields plant, which is on Giberson Road. The pipelines run roughly parallel, so one is in service. The one that runs parallel to it, we're presently working on. If you've driven down South Mountain Road or Giberson Road recently, you've probably seen some of the construction going on. Since the 2 pipelines run roughly parallel, the relevant part to the future of the project is once we have the second pipeline in service, we can route we can route a higher pressure gas to our CO2 removal plant at Shields Canyon, and that'll allow us to process it and cease flaring and continue operating the liquid extraction and processing as we did before.
So all of the gas that goes through these two lines, or goes through, currently going through the B line and will go through the Unocal line, requires CO2 removal?
The gas that's presently going through the B line, since we can't operate the CO2 removal system because of pressure, the only gas that we can get into the B line is sweet gas, is gas that doesn't have a significant amount of CO2 to it. So the Silver Thread and the Ojai leases, both being high CO2 fields, we're incapable of sending that gas into the system because the only CO2 extraction plant that we have requires the high pressure. Since we can't operate the pipeline at a high pressure, we have to flare the high CO2 gas so that we can continue to process and not flare the low CO2 gas, which is South Mountain, Bardesdale, Timber Canyon, and Hamp, I believe.
So you are currently sending gas through this line. It goes to the Shields Canyon plant, but it's not used there?
It goes by the Shields Canyon plant. It actually bypasses the Shields Canyon plant and then is processed at our Santa Clara gas plant.
Thank you. I have another question. In the discussion, it talks about the Hamp flare, which is a permitted flare, and isn't part of the discussion, isn't part of your petition. But then it continues to be discussed, and it seems that it's playing a role in your operations right now that it didn't play before, in terms of being used to flare some gas. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, the Hamp flare, though it is on permit, is permitted for emergency use only, and there is a limitation, I believe, if I remember correctly, Mr. Herlock, I think it's $7 million for a year. Yes, $7 million for a year. And if we exceed that, the reason why we keep mentioning the Hamp flare, if we exceed that $7 million, then we would need the variance protection for that also.
But you're currently using it, and you currently haven't exceeded your, I presume it's a rolling 12-month permitted amount.
It is a rolling 12-month amount, and I don't have that number off the top of my head right now, Mr. Herlock. I can get that to the district to supply to the board.
But my question really is that it's not part of the discussion, but it seems like it should be, because it seems to play a role in your at least temporary activities, but it's not needing a waiver. Right? I understand that, right?
Yes, the Hamp flare, I believe, operationally is only piped in to service the Hamp lease. I don't think it's possible to send. Is it? No, it's not possible to send gas from either Silver Thread or Ojai to this permitted flare. There's no existing infrastructure to do that.
On page 3, near the bottom, it says, during the emergency variance hearing, Vintage reported that they had been able to route gas from Timber Canyon to a permitted flare at the Hamp lease, and that they had ordered a portable flare to install at the South Mountain field. Can you explain that? What's going on there? Or is it continuing to go on?
The Timber Canyon gas is now routed to the D-rated pipeline. The South Mountain, the temporary flare that we had in, the flare is still there, but South Mountain gas is now going in the D-rated pipeline to Santa Clara Valley plant. If I can, initially the original emergency variance due to the break in the pipeline was for our Bardesdale facility, South Mountain facility, Timber Canyon facility, Hamp, and Ojai and Silverthread, because the majority of the gas were going that way.
Are you currently flaring gas at the Hamp, what you're calling the Hamp flare?
There has been some flaring there, but not as consistent as Ojai and Silverthread.
I'll ask you, and if you don't know, I'll ask the district in a minute. If it's an emergency flare that's allowed to operate for 24 hours, how do you, and you're using it intermittently, how does that get counted?
There is a chart. There's a round chart on the inlet, essentially on the pipe that goes to the flare itself. There's a recording device. There's a chart.
I guess my question is, if that gets used for a total of 24 hours during the course of the variances you already have or the one you're asking for tonight, shouldn't that flare be part of the variance? And if you don't know the answer, I can ask the district when that comes.
I'm sorry, Mr. Herlock, I do not have an answer to that off the top of my head.
In your various levels of curtailment, it sounds like you're now flaring 1,700 cubic feet per day.
That's, I think, the average. Yes.
Can you kind of, that number kind of popped up out of the blue in this on page 7. I think it's explained subsequently on page 8 of the draft order, but I'm wondering if you could explain it to me. Where the whatever you're flaring, which is about 1,700 cubic feet per day, comes from. Not where it comes, where it comes from, and where the number comes from.
There are recording devices at the Ojai flare and at the Silverthread flare. We are taking readings daily. Of the total 1,700 MCF average, roughly 56% is attributable to the Ojai facility, and the remaining 44% would be attributable to the Silverthread facility.
I guess my question is answered. To tell me if I'm correct. On the bottom of page 8, the very last part that says, after the interim variance, Vintage's records showed that the gas volumes range between 1.55 and 1.68 million cubic feet per day. That's the source of the 1,700 number, I guess.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stubblefield.
Just a few more questions. Just to be clear, Member.
Yes.
This was the map that you gave us at the last hearing. The two lines are roughly right here. And I just want to understand you correctly. The gas that you're sending through the B line is at half pressure, and you're sending gas that has significantly high levels of oxygen or CO2 in it. Is that correct? Or
No,
you're just usually sending good gas through here?
that's correct. We're only sending gas that meets
Okay.
the
So-
CO2 limit.
So in effect, you're using the CO2 plant as a receiving plant right now? Not
It's actually bypassed. It's technically, the CO2 plant is completely shut down, and
Where does it go when it doesn't go to the CO2 plant?
it bypasses the CO2 plant, and the gas continues down Giberson Road to Torrey Canyon, to the Piru plant. Santa Clara Valley Gas Plant is located at Piru, and which is a full processing plant, a low temperature separation plant that extracts propanes and butanes, but it doesn't have any CO2 removal capability.
Okay. And the other pipe is the one that you're repairing from one end to the other
That's correct.
by inserting a new composite pipe, as I recall?
That's correct.
You're just running it through the old pipe?
We are in the process of executing that project, yes.
What measures, if any, are you taking to expedite the completion of that project? Are people working 7 days a week? Are they working around the clock? Or are they just coming in, doing 8-hour days and going home and not working weekends?
We're really executing in any expedited way that we can. However, there are only certain avenues that are really open to us from a execution standpoint. Ventura County Transportation District only allows us to operate on county roads, and realize these pipelines are all actually within the roadway of Ventura County roads. They allow us to operate a certain number of hours a day. We're not allowed to operate in any inclement weather event. But that being said, so what we've done to expedite the project is mobilize multiple crews. So instead of working one location by location, we have multiple crews. We are, if you notice, we're operating we're opening up excavations and preparing the pipe on Giberson Road with one series of construction crews, and on South Mountain Road with another series. Ventura County Transportation also has limited the number of excavation pits that we can open at any time, because of course they're concerned about the hazard to traffic, and traffic control is a major portion of this project. However, when we came with a rough schedule, the previous hearing and before, we'd outlined a plan, and I've got an update here that was handed out as Exhibit 2. We are on schedule with this project. We have mobilized construction. We've obtained encroachment permits from, if you might recall, there was a little bit of discussion about getting encroachment permits from the County of Ventura. That was successfully worked out with the county. So we have encroachment permits. We have contractor mobilized at multiple locations. We have subcontracted certain elements that we had to install some line bores, which is fairly sophisticated drilling equipment that drills horizontally underneath the roadway. We've completed all of the line bores that needed to be done for this project. We have mobilized some very sophisticated internal line cleaning apparatus that's been mobilized and tested and brought to site. So from a readiness standpoint, we're doing very well. I will go up to the very top few lines of the schedule, and there is an issue that we are working with that has to do with the DOT jurisdiction of this pipeline. In order to operate the composite pipeline, we do need to have a a authorization waiver from jurisdictional DOT. Because DOT doesn't, in the code of regulations, they just don't recognize non-steel pipelines. Such pipelines are used in DOT service elsewhere in the country. Such pipelines are routinely used offshore and in other services. However, we don't yet have a waiver in place to utilize this pipe. We have DOT has acknowledged receipt of our application. They tell us that they have assigned it out to their technical engineers. We expected to receive a waiver at the end of October. We did not receive that. We're diligently working the issue between now on a legal basis between DOT and company legal to find out what it is that's holding up the receipt of the waiver and when we could expect to receive it.
So is it conceivable that you could complete reconstruction of this pipeline and then not be authorized as of that time to?
Anything is conceivable, but
is DOT aware that you're flaring so-called dirty natural gas 24/7?
that I believe that there is some lack of communication and some clarification that needs to happen between my company and DOT. The way the DOT got involved is our waiver application actually went to California Public Utility Commission. Public Utility Commission forwarded it on to DOT, and it's been an arm's length discussion. We have Vintages now worked with DOT. We've got we've had some preliminary discussions. We have scheduled discussion for tomorrow, at which we will we'll bring into discussion that there is a variance. We are under schedule and an agreement to install this pipeline. From an actual critical project standpoint, this is a critical issue. It needs to be worked out. Our pipeline installation crew is ready to start pulling the pipe December 1st. The pipe is on the ground. We've negotiated a purchase order already. So from a physical transport, delivery, installation, it's workable. From a jurisdictional issue, I believe it can be worked out, and it's now my challenge and my company to get this worked out timely.
I was under the impression you already were laying pipe, so you're not going to start that until you get this authorization. Is that correct?
There are certain portions of the pipeline that we could install because they're non-jurisdictional. I believe it would be, well, it is premature, and I need some additional clarification in order to decide to install the pipe without DOT approval.
Would authorization have been expedited had you chosen steel instead of composite?
A steel pipe wouldn't require the authorization. However, installation of a steel pipe along 10 miles of Ventura County roads is prohibitive. It is cost prohibitive, and it's more expensive. There are right-of-way issues, there are jurisdictional issues, there are legislative issues, whereas, and of course there are, and this is an existing pipeline that the right-of-way is intact, the pipeline is intact, it's a slip line, and we're applying a known technology.
Is it the old pipeline steel?
Correct, it is.
So why would there be jurisdictional issues with a composite pipe that there wouldn't be with steel? Wouldn't they be the same either way?
It's not a jurisdictional issue. It's basically County of Ventura road crossings. It's construction issues.
Strength. Vehicles driving over it.
No. It's getting approval to install a new 10-mile pipeline in.
Regardless of what it's made out of.
Correct. Because if it was a matter of installing a new pipeline, we install new pipelines in oil field applications all the time, but to functionally route this amount of gas from South Mountain to Shields Entrance, a 10-mile long pipeline running through rural Ventura County, the only practical way to route that pipeline is with an existing pipeline. A new pipeline, I say prohibitive from environmental impact, from a county, count the number of 10-mile long pipelines that have been installed in Ventura County in the last few years, and the number is zero.
Okay, well, I appreciate your answers, and I appreciate the conundrum in which you find yourself. But I should probably share with you, I don't know if I call it an ex parte discussion, but I was contacted by a member of the press. I think you should know that. So this project is extraordinary in that sense, because in all the years I've been on the hearing board, perhaps, a decade, I've never been contacted by a member of the press regarding any decision we made, which could mean that this project's going to come under increasing scrutiny as time goes on if it drags out. So should the members of the board tonight decide to grant you this variance, I would urge you to expedite this project and get it done as soon as possible.
I appreciate that, and I assure you we will work to any extent expediting we can. And the issue that we intend to push to bring forward is that we are flaring, that it is a federal error issue, that we are under a timeline, and so that's why I'm assured. I believe sanity will prevail in that the legal issues will get, which is what it is with the DOT waiver, will get worked out, and that we are on critical path to have this pipeline installed and operational as committed.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions.
Any last questions before? Yes, Mr. Murphy.
I've got a little bit of follow-up to just make sure I'm understanding Mr. Stubbs' question. That when he asked you, couldn't this be done with steel pipe, you were talking about putting a new steel line in. Could you possibly put a 6-inch line steel in the 8-inch unical line? Would that be a possibility?
We did evaluate that. We determined it really wasn't feasible because the steel pipe just isn't quite flexible enough to be able to pull around the bends that exist. So we'd say it really, we couldn't pull a steel pipe through. It didn't have the flexibility that a composite pipe would. So we really wouldn't be able to make it to get it installed.
What are, I mean, DOT has those little round holes, or if you have a bump on it, but, they just don't know how to deal with it. But what is the issues with DOT? Why would they care whether you've got as long as the strength is the same, that you would have composite as opposed to steel?
And I think that is ultimately why they will rule that this is our risk. As the operator, we always take the risk for all of our installations. There are ASTM standards established for the material that we propose to use. There are established engineering guidelines for design of the composite material we propose to use. There are other similar instances in the country and the world where it's being used. I think from a DOT standpoint, it's a unwillingness to endorse something out of the ordinary. And so I think what the win-win solution is going to be that Vintage is going to install it. We'll install it at our risk, if you will, and we will manage it in good practices. And DOT will utilize this as a test case for this composite product, so that they can have additional background data on it.
Is there anything the district could help you with in your dealings with DOT?
It's possible, and I guess what I would like to do is refer to these proceedings in dealing with the DOT to provide them with the seriousness of the predicament that we're in, and I think that will suffice at this point. Thank you.
Any other questions of the petitioner from the board? I was just going to make a comment. I really looked closely at your Exhibit 2 that you submitted this evening, and your schedule is pretty close to what you submitted about 2 months ago. And so I thought that was pretty good until you brought up the issue of DOT. And I think Mr. Stubblefield's comment is that you're dealing with governmental agencies, et cetera, and there's a way of doing business in those, and it really behooves you to expedite the communication. And anyway, you folks know that. No, I don't have any other questions at this time. And there is one more, Mr. Herlock.
First, I'd like to ask Mr. Oriano whether we can or whether we should or need to include the map from September 28th hearing that's part of Exhibit 1 in tonight's package, or whether it's kind of included by reference already.
I don't believe it's been included, so you ought to include any prior materials.
I guess I'd like to include the Exhibit 1. I believe I guess I'd like to ask that we include Exhibit 1 and Exhibit 2 from September 28th in tonight's package. I'm assuming that the board order, variance order, is already on the record and does not need to be included.
The prior interim?
Yeah, the interim.
The interim work, that's correct, but it's a separate hearing.
Right. I guess I'd like to include these two exhibits then in tonight's package. How do we do that?
Just to make a motion and to include it in the record.
Okay.
I believe what was provided, and I'd like to ask maybe the petitioner for clarification of what Mr. Herlock just identified, is that your maps that you've provided, but the ones that are more specific, are they not further clarifications of what you provided earlier as Exhibit 2, or are they different?
there are 2 Exhibit 2s and 2 Exhibit 1s,
Yeah. 2
from today and 2 from the prior
I
hearing.
think I just answered my question because I see in the original exhibits from September the 28th, they didn't really identify, the petitioner did not identify the real location by annotation on the maps where the school was and the nearest residence. So I agree with Mr. Herlock that the board should consider adding the prior exhibits that were provided on the 28th as part of this particular variance hearing. Do I have a motion on that? Do we need a motion, or can we just?
Can't the chair just include it on its own? On the property?
Anyone can submit it, and then it's in part of the record.
Okay.
I have another comment for the petitioner.
So that will be submitted also, as a record should reflect that the board wishes to have the prior exhibits included with this specific hearing this evening. Mr. Herlock.
Yeah. One of the things we need to find tonight in order to grant this petition is this item 2 on page 7 that says that due to conditions beyond the reasonable control of the petitioner requiring compliance would result in either A or B. I don't need to read the whole thing. This is one we always have trouble with, and I think Mr. Stubblefield's questions, really make it somewhat difficult to find that vintage, and by that I mean all levels of vintage, all the way to the corporate, have done what they could do, done everything they could do to expedite the DOT hang-up with respect to this petition. I've worked for big corporations as well, and sometimes smaller divisions hesitate to ask for help when they need it, but I think if you haven't asked for help, then you come close to not doing everything you could, and I don't know if you have, and then the corporate, you guys, it's always a trade-off whether you want to upset the agency you're trying to deal with by going around the chain of command or not, but that's an area that's a little difficult to find.
Okay, at this time I'd like to direct and ask the district for stating their position on granting the variance or any comments that they have of the petitioner, and also I'm sure the board will have questions following.
Thank you. In our draft variance order and in our letter to your board, we tried to make things a little bit clearer this time than we did last time as far as how much was being flared by which location, and so you have several tables showing the amount of gas that's being flared both at the Silver Thread lease and the Ojai lease, because I think there might have been an impression after the last hearing that all of the gas was being flared maybe at the Upper Ojai or the Ojai fee lease, when that really wasn't the case. And it's being fairly well split between the two flares, which are about, I think it's 1.6 miles apart. So we're not getting the full 2 million cubic feet a day being flared at one site. We've also, in our letter, provided you with our countywide emissions inventory, so you can compare the magnitude of emissions from these two flares as compared to our entire emissions inventory for the county. And the inventory we used is from the State Air Resources Board, which is an average day. It's an annualized basis, but averaged over a day. Sometimes we also provide numbers from our own inventory based on a summer's day, but we felt that maybe the best way would just be kind of an annualized emission inventory basis. And I think you can see that the majority of the figures are down 0.12, 0.11, 0.19% of our total inventory split between these two leases. There's also something that hasn't come out tonight that we've pointed out in our letter, and I think in the draft order, is that the Shields Canyon gas plant has been shut down because they don't have gas to produce. So there's the process, to process, right. And so there is not a one-for-one emission offset occurring there, but there is an emission reduction that's occurring from having the Shields Canyon gas plant shut down while this pipeline is being replaced and while the flaring is occurring. There was a question about, and some discussion earlier about flares, and thinking about it, we typically here in the county have maybe 3 different types of flaring scenarios. We do have some facilities that have ongoing flares. Those are flares that have to produce or have to flare a continuous waste gas. We have a facility up on the Rincon Highway that takes in natural gas from the platforms. They process it. They end up with a tail gas that has extremely high content of CO2. It also has some hydrocarbons in it. They have to flare that gas. So that's a continuous flare that you might see driving up and down the highway at the Rincon. Some other flares that we have are those flares that are on permit. They're permitted to operate. The permits provide or allow a certain amount of gas to be flared on a rolling 12-month basis. Most of those permitted flares are flares that are used in both in an emergency situation and for routine maintenance operations. The company may have to shut down a compressor to do maintenance on it, so they'll send their gas to that flare as part of the process turnaround. When a flare is involved in a maintenance operation, it's not considered to be an emergency or a safety flare. And then we have a number of unpermitted emergency flares. They're not on the permit. It's the operator's choice to keep them off permit. But as we've run into here, they run the chance of when they go beyond their 24 hours, they have to come to your board for either an emergency variance or regular variance. And that's happens occasionally. It's happened several times over the last 10 or 15 years. The hemp flare that we've talked about is permitted. It's I haven't looked at the permit, but Mr. Levins indicates that it's at an emergency flare. I think Vintage inherited that flare from the previous operator, a company called Seneca Resources. And I believe Seneca had that flare on permit, so it might have just kind of rolled over into the Vintage permit. Typically, when we permit flares, we give them an allowance of gas that the operator requests based on what they think they're going to have to do as far as maintenance operations and maybe some small amount of emergency upsets. They pay emission fees for those flares to operate. They have to keep records. They're subject to penalties, notices of violation and penalties if they exceed those permitted limits. And again, they have to come back to your board if they have to exceed those permitted limits. So that's kind of a quick rundown on the flares that we have, trying to clarify some of those questions. Question came up regarding, and this question comes up occasionally when we do have situations like this, about wells that, let's say, question comes up whether a lease should be shut down or all of the wells shut in to mitigate the flaring that's occurring. It's always been our understanding from what we've heard from a number of different producers, as Mr. Hankins said, is that they stand the chance of losing those wells. They sand up, they fall apart, and it's been our understanding that they can bring those wells back, maybe not at 100%, but to bring them back requires drill rigs to come back in, go into those wells, re-drill them, clean them out, and then you're talking about a number of diesel drill rigs operating, generating additional pollution, and in these cases, diesel particulate matter, which is now a carcinogen. So that's one of the things to keep in mind if you want to think about requiring them to shut the leases down, is that there is this potential for having to bring diesel rigs back in to bring those wells back online if they do sand up or have problems. Chris Cody and I briefly looked at the amount of gas that's being flared from the reports that Mr. Lovins has been sending us. And the HAMP lease, which I think Mr. Herlock had a question about the flaring there. For about the first 3 or 4 weeks during the emergency variance, that lease, that flare had some operation, continuous operation, it looks like. Not as much flaring as the other 2 leases. I think since the middle to late August, that flare has had very minimal operation. Like many of the days are showing 0 gas being burned in that lease or in that flare. So yes, it looks like starting around the 1st of August, there's been very minimal gas being flared in that lease. We did note in the draft order and in our letter that we received one complaint from one of the neighbors and wanted to address that. We did send an inspector out. He found some possible other emission sources or another emission source nearby, but I'm not trying to say that the complainant didn't have a valid complaint. When the complainant and I talked in October, I informed them that we were having a hearing tonight, gave her the date, said she could send a letter to the clerk of the board if she wanted, she could come testify. And then last Thursday evening, I called the complainant, said, want to give you a reminder, hearing is Monday night, 5:30, give me a call if you have questions, and have not heard from that person. So I'll leave it at that, but we did receive a complaint, did make an effort to let that person know that there was a hearing tonight, and it was a chance to be heard. Other than some questions for Vintage, that somewhat concludes my presentation. I would say maybe that I think at this point we would support Vintage's petition just based on the fact that there is potential for having to come back in and re-drill their wells, possibly a very significant financial cost to Vintage, and also to the potential, if they did have to shut down their leases, that there could be some people without jobs for a point of time.
If it's okay, I know the board had a few questions, and I think you probably answered most of them, but if it's okay with the board, maybe if the district could ask the petitioner, I think you said you had some questions of the petitioner, and
yes,
maybe some additional questions that the board might be asking might be answered, so please go ahead.
Okay. So you are comfortable with the February 22nd final compliance date? For Mr. Hankins or Mr. Lovins?
Yes, that's the schedule we're working with, schedule, the mobilization that we have. We support that final compliance and to have our system operating and have ceased flaring at that date.
Okay. The 10 miles of pipeline that you're going to replace, that's from the Shields gas plant to the Santa Clara Valley gas plant?
No, it's from the it's from an area near our South Mountain. How do I describe that? It's a juncture where the gas from South Mountain comes off the hill and on South Mountain Road meets up with, in a pipeline, meets up with the gas that comes from Ojai. And so it's from that juncture all the way to the entrance of the Shields plant. And so that's why it's geographically, it's just about all of South Mountain Road, back roads through the community of Bardsdale, and then 2 miles of Giberson Road to the Shields Canyon entrance.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
I have a question. I'm still trying to understand. Yeah, I understand that you're going to replace that section of pipeline, but I'm still trying to understand how you're going to have enough pressure to get the gas from Ojai into Shields Canyon. Are you going to put a compressor at that junction?
A good question. We rely on the field compression to send the gas all the way to the plant and through the plant. So the compression that will be required to send all that gas from Ojai, Silver Thread, Hamp, Timber Canyon, those compressors will be installed at Silver Thread, Ojai, Hamp, and Timber Canyon. Those are electric-driven reciprocating compressors that are already installed and already functional, with the exception of one additional compressor that's being installed at Silver Thread. But those are all electric-driven compressors that have existing capacity and existing operating protocol and infrastructure, such that once this pipeline is built, they get turned on and they will supply the operating pressure necessary to push the gas down the hill, through the pipeline, through the Shields Canyon plant, and onto the Santa Clara plant without any other compression required.
But I thought that portion of the line from Ojai down to, well, I guess maybe to that juncture, or maybe all the way to Shields, is the part that has to be low pressure at this point. So I'm still not quite understanding that.
The new pipeline will be capable of operating at high pressure. The existing pipeline that's in low pressure service is satisfactory for bypassing gas. So the South Mountain natural gas can bypass can continue to operate in low pressure and bypass the Shields Canyon plant and get joined up with the tail gas from the resid gas from the Shields Canyon plant, and then go to Santa Clara. The pipeline that exists from the vicinity of Ojai down to this juncture at South Mountain is fully capable of high pressure operation.
Oh, okay.
So that pipeline is well tested. Is a fairly new pipeline. We have operating history of it, and so that's all ready for high pressure service. So the gap is the pipeline, the 10-mile pipeline that we've proposed from there to Shields entrance. Thank you.
Okay, that answers it, because I thought that was the weak part, was the part from Ojai down the hill. So, okay.
I don't have any other questions. be glad to answer any of the board's
Okay,
questions.
now does the board have any additional questions for the district? Mr. Stubblefield.
I want to ask the district some questions about this complainant. I want to ask the district some questions about the complainant. Does the complainant live at one of the homes that's listed on either of these maps provided to us by the petitioner? Because I noticed there's a, from the Ojai flare to a residence, it's .24 miles, and then the Silver Thread flare, there's a residence .22 miles, .30 miles, .22 miles. Does this individual live at any of these locations?
The complainant, I want to be careful not to identify the complainant, but the complainant lives in the.
Well,
very-
I'm not trying
Right.
to figure out the.
No, I understand. But the complainant lives in very close proximity to the Ojai flare. They're in the upper Ojai area.
There's only one residence listed on this map that's close.
Yes,
Says nearest residence, .24 miles.
yes.
Okay. What is the district's rule of thumb? Could you refresh my memory on what it considers an acceptable minimum distance for a residence from a flare? Is it a mile?
No, we don't have any distance criteria for sighting to a flare. I would say that if Vintage or any other operator wanted to install a new flare, we would require them to do some modeling to make sure that the emissions didn't impact nearest residences or schools. But in this case, I know that flare's been there for probably 15 to 20 years. So
Longer than the residence?
Possibly, or predating our criteria or requirements to do the modeling and evaluation of its impact.
Does the district or the petitioner know what the prevailing winds are there? You can see where I'm going with this. I'm just trying to figure out if this could be a significant air quality impact on someone living .24 miles from the flare. I mean,
Yeah.
it's somewhat contingent on which way the wind blows.
Yeah, and you've got really some kind of unique terrain there because to the backside of the flare is I guess it would be South Mountain, Sulphur Mountain.
I'm just talking about.
So you've got kind of a downslope situation there. On the other side of the valley, you've got the, I guess it would be the Topatopas, and then the highway runs through kind of a valley area. So you've got some kind of complex terrain. I really couldn't tell you how the wind would flow, and it probably depends. You may get some winds in the evenings down the slope of the mountain. During the daytime, it might go along the highway, direction of the highway, whether it's east-west, I think it might be.
So the district just kind of takes the proximity of a residence to a flare kind of on a case-by-case basis. Is that accurate?
Well,
And look at significant factors.
If we were going to do or have an applicant do some modeling, they would have to be looking at carefully looking at the wind patterns, distances, topography, things like that. In this case, I think we've got a lot of pre-existing kind of, you might say, grandfathered sources and residences, receptors.
And what the inspector found was that it was probably more likely, that this apparent asthma flare-up was probably more likely caused by seepage?
It's a
The inspector simply
possibility.
said that was another factor.
That's an emission source that's nearby. Whether that was the cause of the complainant's health complaint, we just really couldn't tell. We do know that there are hydrocarbon emissions off of that seep.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Murphy?
In the presentation, that there's policy, allowing it to make plans up to 24 hours. Is this a policy that the Air Pollution Control District Board has established, or is this just a prosecutorial discretion policy, or what is, how, is it written?
It's a written staff policy. The Air Pollution Control Board has not adopted it as a policy or a rule, but it's a policy that we internally developed maybe 5 years ago to try and keep control on the flaring that was occurring at the time, and to set some limits.
Are you going to set, when you develop policies like that, do you basically take them to the board?
No, we don't.
With page 5 of the presentation, that it mentions that excuse me, I'm sorry. It'll take me a while. That the excess emissions on the tables are based on flaring of approximately 2 million cubic feet of gas per day, but yet when the emergency variance, there was a flaring of about close to 4 million. How did we, has the flaring gone down in half approximately, and how did that occur?
When the emergency variance came about, when this first happened, they felt that they were going to have to flare gas from various different leases, the South Mountain Field, Timber Canyon up above Santa Paula, Bardesdale lease. So the 4 million cubic feet per day encompassed all of that gas. And I think it was within several weeks that Vintage was able to figure out that they could use this other pipeline, the low-pressure pipeline, and at least get half of that gas to the Santa Clara Valley gas plant.
Okay. And then on page 6, and probably everybody else knows this other than me, it says countywide emissions inventory of criteria pollutants. Explain to me what that means.
The
Staff report.
Page 6 of 8. Yeah.
Yeah, we've historically issued our permits and regulated 5 pollutants: reactive organic compounds, oxides of nitrogen, particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, and carbon monoxide. So kind of in the air pollution world, those are referred to as the criteria pollutants. There are some other pollutants that we're now putting on permits and regulating toxic air contaminants and things like that.
Well, when you say the inventory of criteria pollutants, what does that mean?
The emissions inventory is it's a compilation of data from all of our permitted sources, plus what we might call area sources, mobile sources. The State Air Resources Board looks at a lot of data to develop an emissions inventory. How much gasoline is sold in the county, how much diesel fuel is sold, how many vehicle miles traveled are within the county. Then they calculate motor vehicle emissions, emissions from trains, based on these different parameters. The heating your home, the gas that's burned in your furnace, or in the pilot light of your water heater, all of those go into the emission inventory. The amount of solvents that are used by painting operations, flares, internal combustion engines that are operated by oil companies and others. So it's just a compilation of every emission source that they can think of in the county to come up and say, okay, on any given day or within a year, here's how much emissions are being emitted into this county or this
So therefore, if I look at the last table there on page 6, where it says 2008 inventory pounds per day, that going down that, this is in the county of Ventura, this is the amount of pounds per day on the average that is generated within the county on any particular given day. We're going to, through all the sources, have 93,820 pounds of ROC, hydrocarbons, 127,000 pounds of NOx, etc.
That's correct.
And so then on the last column there, the Ohio lease percents, that is the amount that if we grant this variance, we will be the percentage increase that we will be allowing within the county.
That's correct.
So it's almost 0.2% and less.
That's correct, yes.
Then in the order, on page 10, in the conclusions and order, just the terminology here, just to increase my knowledge, paragraph numbered 1, it says, no produced or recovered gas shall be vented or stacked to the atmosphere. What does stacked mean?
Stacked is a term that just kind of refers to allowing gas to vent from a pipe or from a unlit flare, you might say, just vented to the atmosphere.
Does stacked mean anything different from vented?
No, it's somewhat of a common oil field term, I think. It's kind of shorthand, I guess, in the oil field.
And then on the next page, points out that the petitioner is going to have to pay excess emissions fee, and we've got quite a bit of emissions going on here. What are we talking about per day in emissions fee?
My recollection is that at the time that we worked on the interim variance, the excess emission fees for the interim variance, I believe, were in the neighborhood of $6,000.
Total or per day?
Total. And then that fee is based on the actual amount of gas that they flare, so it's calculated after the fact. But at that time, we rough estimated based on what the maximum potential of the interim variance was. I'm not sure what, based on the current situation, what the excess emission fee would be. But I would like to point out that the excess emission fee is not to be considered as a penalty. If these flares were on permit, they would have permitted emissions that the company would be paying for on an annual basis. But in this case, the emissions are not on permit, so they're actually paying twice what the permit fees would be.
If they aren't penalties, what are they?
It's a fee. It's because they don't have them on permit, so we feel that they should at least pay for what they should have been if they were on permit. And the second, the doubling of it is
A penalty.
I guess you could say a penalty. When I said it's not a penalty, I meant in the term of us issuing them a notice of violation and saying you violated a law, now pay us a penalty. But I guess you could look at it as a penalty for not having them on the permit or having to produce, for allowing them to produce excess emissions.
Well, excess emissions, even in a permit, are kind of, they have a deterrent quality, right? That's why they're there? Or is it just a money gathering operation?
I think the intent when it was developed was to be somewhat of a deterrent. In this case, 6,000, 12,000, 25,000 probably isn't much of a deterrent to vintage production. To a small operator, it could be a big deterrent.
Oh, but small operator wouldn't be putting out the amount of excess emissions we've got here.
No, not in this case. But we have, I think, had some small businesses that have had some fairly substantial excess emissions. That it's been a big chunk of money for them to come up with.
And again, the APCD board is the one that sets how much these are supposed to be.
That's correct.
No other questions? Mr. Herlock, I'm going to ask my question, okay? Please. The one question I have of the district, I had to go look in the health and safety code with regards to the length of a variance, and then looking earlier at the schedule and then hearing, surprisingly, about the DOT issue, I cannot believe that both the petitioner and the district are happy with February the 22nd as the end of the variance date. And so is there, or would there be consideration to add the additional 14, 16 days from when they thought they were going to have it, which I thought was November the 2nd, to today, which would be the 16th? So add that number of days or not? That's just a question.
Add that to the end of the variance?
I guess my question directly is, why was the 22nd as the date established for the completion and variance date?
When the original petition was submitted, they asked for February 18th. And when I started calculating when they would have to submit a petition to come back again, because of the holiday, because there's, President's Day and whatever, they were going to have to come back by December 11th or something with another petition, and they aren't going to know very much by that time. It's not, not that much further into the projects. So by moving it 4 days, it lets them come back in January instead of December. So it gives them a little extra time. So that's what I went with. I mean, I'm concerned too about the DOT approval, that could drag on for a long time. So, but that's an unknown. So we can leave it the way it is at February 22nd and just plan on them coming back again with an update at that point. It's up to the board what you want to do.
Okay, well, let the board, when we close the hearing, discuss that particular item. Mr. Herlock? Thank you.
I have a couple of minor questions with respect to the draft order. On page 5, under rule requirements and violations, I believe the second sentence there should read the following: district rules are applicable to this, not interim variance, but
That's correct.
regular variance, or whatever the proper terminology is. Probably a cut and paste that didn't get caught.
Yep.
And on page 11 of the draft order, under item 2, part C, I don't remember seeing previously that we require the petitioner to calculate the excess emissions. There's nothing wrong with asking them to do that, but I guess I'd like some assurance, since they're paying a fee based on the excess emissions, that the district will at least do an independent calculation to determine the excess emissions upon which the fee is based. It doesn't seem right to ask the petitioner to do that, to
Right.
depend on the petitioner to do that.
Yeah, we will verify all of their emission calculations when they do that.
Okay. That's it.
Any other questions of the board right at this point? Okay. And, okay, there's a question that the board member has, Mr. Stubblefield, of the petitioner.
I apologize for not asking this question earlier, but help me understand. The reason that you are not sending this high CO2 natural gas to the Shields plant is not because it won't get there using 125 psi.
No, that is correct. It can get there at 120 psi, but that's not enough
But the
pressure.
plant itself requires 250.
The plant requires somewhere around 150.
Speaking as an auto mechanic, would it be technically, I mean, and I'm concerned about this DOT issue, how difficult technically would it be to just put what I would call a stepper pump at the end of the line, right where it goes into the Shields plant, and bump it up to 250 or whatever the appropriate pressure is, and process it, rather than flare it?
And
I mean, these flares do connect, right, to that, they can connect.
the
Not the
pipeline,
flares, but I mean,
that's correct.
the gas that's being flared can be routed
The
through
pipeline
there.
can.
That's not a problem.
So front-end compression, just to put it in rough terms, is it would require 300 horsepower of work, and would, in all cases, be a temporary fix, whereas using the field compressors and the new pipeline is permanent. It's a permanent and sustainable fix. It is technically feasible.
Well, I'm not proposing this as an alternative to the new pipe. I'm just proposing it as a temporary fix to enable you to, perhaps, I'm asking you, if there's some technical reason why you couldn't do that, and thereby process this natural gas, get the CO2 out of it, and sell it, which is what you're in business to do, is to sell oil and natural gas. I realize you're mainly an oil company, but you do sell natural gas when it's sellable, and this isn't. But normally you'd be cleaning this up at the plant, at the CO2 plant. And I'm just asking, what would be I mean, how expensive is a pump like that? Is it that expensive?
It's
Can you lease one?
Just let's step back a little bit. I'm in the business of installing gas compressors in Ventura County, LA County, Kern County. To install a compressor, multi-hundred horsepower, and get it done in less than several months is a schedule, is very schedule intensive. To install a compressor that's more than 300 horsepower on a temporary basis in almost all situations is a internal combustion engine driven compressor. Such items are available for rent, but that opens up emissions and air permit issues, as well as scheduling and infrastructure and operational changes that that would have to be a completely parallel effort, because as I step back from a long-term standpoint, the long-term fix is to install the pipeline and use front-end, use field compression to push the gas through the pipeline and through the plant. Technically, it is feasible to put front-end compression at the plant.
Are you saying it would cost more money than the amount of money, the amount of income you're losing by simply flaring it?
Yes, it would. But yes, but
Can you give me a ballpark figure?
that probably wouldn't be wise. No, I'm in the business of in engineering and design projects. It's always amazing how almost insignificant the cost of a piece of equipment is compared to the installation, because it requires a foundation, and it requires piping tie-ins, and it requires control systems, and it requires operator training, and it requires management of change documentation, and in order to put in a new piece of equipment is in this sort of a complex system is very extensive, and while technically feasible, would have to be a completely parallel effort. And at the end of the effort, if we found out that it took 5 months to install the compressor and the pipeline was ready in 2.5 or 3 months, then of course it was not valuable effort expended. At this point, I still am convinced that the value for Vintage and for the district and for the process is to focus on our primary solution.
I'm not disputing that. Actually, I was just more concerned about the waste. Every time a petitioner comes in from, whose primary product is oil, they simply decide to flare. They have permission to flare natural gas while they make repairs. So, I was just curious. Thank you.
Any other questions of the board, of either the district or the petitioner at this time? Okay, I'd like to close the hearing, and at this point I'd like to ask for the board members if there's a discussion on any items or anything else that needs to be done, or a motion on the variance.
As far as discussion, I'll repeat what I said to the petitioner. I can probably make the finding of that they did the best they could, but it's a tough call in this case because of what appears to be not worrying as much about DOT right from the get-go as they probably should have, but that's kind of a hindsight call, but I think I can make the finding, but it's tough.
From a practical matter, having dealt over the years with DOT, that having delay caused by DOT is something that's definitely beyond the reasonable control of mortals. It sounded like any delay that was caused by the petitioner was in making the wrong choice jurisdictionally of going to the PUC first rather than directly to DOT, which is not an uncommon mistake when you're dealing with something like this. So I wouldn't perceive that to be a problem.
I'll second that thought process. Mr. Stubblefield?
Well, I'm kind of concerned that it sounds as if the county, the Ventura County, did you say the Transportation Commission? Not you, but I mean the petitioner. You said that the transportation people were, it sounded like you were saying they were an obstacle to expediting the work.
No, that's not the case. At the interim variance, when we came here in September, we were negotiating with the Ventura County Transportation Department in order to get road encroachment permits in order to be able to go in and repair the pipe. Actually, coming out of the hearing that we had in September and going to the Transportation Department explaining that we were working with the Air District, that escalated the process with Ventura County Transportation Department such that we were able to come up with excellent permit conditions with Ventura County. So, no, that's very workable. We have permits in place.
I asked you if you could expedite by putting, you said you put 3 crew, you've got people working on different parts of it. And I was simply asking, well, could they work 7 days a week? And maybe I didn't get a clear answer to that, but the impression I got was that you were saying, well, it would be tough because of county rules.
The Transportation District is very, very clear on certain requirements, and I understand that. They keep these roads as an emergency bypass in case Highway 126 is closed.
But they understand that you're flaring.
They do, and so they've worked with us, and that is why we're able to manage to the schedule that we've put here. And obviously, we wouldn't commit to this schedule if we didn't have some element of control and float in the schedule. So that's why when I'm asked, are we willing to commit to this? Yes, we are. We understand the aspects and can work within all the permit conditions. And there are unforeseen rain delays and other unforeseens that we accept.
And if you see a potential problem with DOT, are you going to work with APCD and get them to perhaps help you expedite that?
I'll work with just about anybody I can.
Make a commitment to do that, to make sure DOT doesn't hold them up.
Thank you very much. And I will just also step back a little bit. Vintage Production California is owned by Occidental Oil and Gas. Occidental is a big corporation that has staff personnel in Washington who are working on this project, are liaising at as high level as we can. So I don't want to give the impression that we are doing nothing at all. It is a major issue for us, and we're working at all levels of the corporation we can.
If I could just make sure I'm understanding with respect to the various, when you're talking about the only being able to work on the roads certain periods of the day, with that you're dealing with Public Works Agency for the County of Ventura you're talking about, is then you've got the Ventura County Transportation Commission. Are they involved in this in any way, shape, or form?
In Ventura County, we're strictly, it is the roadway, the transportation department of Ventura County that controls the pipeline right of way.
So that would be the Public Works Agency of the county itself. I wouldn't think Ventura County Transportation Commission would be involved. When you're talking about the DOT, are you talking about the State Department of Transportation?
No, it's the PHMSA, the PHMSA, the Pipeline Hazardous Material Standards Agency, Federal Department of Transportation. That's the jurisdiction.
Okay.
Okay. I've closed the hearing, so what I'd like to ask is if I can get a motion to grant the variance by any of the board members. Okay, we have a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Is there a need for any discussion before I ask the clerk to call for the vote? I do have one comment. In accepting this, I would like consideration, and maybe it requires an adjustment to the motion, but since it's been seconded, I guess we have to call the question, is to change that date to the 22nd, rather than come back here sometime before that to go through this process again, because it appears that the district has a little bit of concern, or maybe a lot of concern, about DOT as well as the petitioner. Maybe it's in the best interest to ask in the motion if the board could ask, unless the district has an issue with this, ask for an extension of maybe 3 weeks to 1 month on that date for the interim variance. And I'd like to ask council if that's acceptable.
Should ask the moving member if he'll accept the amendment and the seconder.
So this goes back to the person that made the motion, Mr. Murphy. And the second, is that acceptable?
I have no problem with it.
Okay, discussion?
I guess a little bit of a problem, the board offering more time, more flaring, when I think we've given the petitioner ample opportunity to tell us that that schedule is doable, and they said they have, that they think it's doable with the DOT unknown, but giving them 3 more weeks doesn't affect that at all. So I have a little bit of problem just giving them another 3 weeks and another 3 weeks of flaring, almost 2 million cubic feet a day. If they haven't, if they say they think they can do it, I think we should, I would be in favor of not granting them an unasked for extension.
Any other comments? I guess the only thing I would say in response to that is that there are conditions that the petitioner has in terms of reporting, and that I think it's the onus is on the petitioner to ensure that they can demonstrate to the district beyond a shadow of a doubt that they're doing everything, and if Occidental Petroleum, whatever it is, that's the parent company, is involved, I think it behooves the petitioner to demonstrate that you're doing everything you can in your power to facilitate getting DOT to do what they need to do. So there has been a motion, it's been seconded. I ask the clerk to call the vote.
Mr. Stubblefield, how do you vote?
Aye.
Mr. Murphy, how do you vote?
Aye.
Mr. Herlock, how do you vote?
No.
And Mr. Gasparino, how do you vote?
Aye. Okay, so for the petitioner, your variance has been granted with the extension that was identified in the motion. I don't think we have any other business. Is there anything that the district has to report at this time?
Can you clarify for me what the date was? I'm looking at the calendar, and if you add 3 weeks, that puts it to March 15th. Is that what you were intending?
Yes.
Okay.
If that's what the 3-week date comes to.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question for the district. You've closed this hearing?
Yeah, the hearing was closed. That's correct.
I see that we still have finding number 8 in our requirement here. Since this is not a diesel source, I don't have any problem with that, but can you tell us how the activity rulemaking, whatever it is, that hopefully will ultimately get rid of finding 8 is going?
I don't believe that any work has been started yet, but I know it's important, and it's on our rulemaking list of things to do. I'll take that concern back to our director to.
Yeah, I mean, I've stated before, diesel exhaust is one of the most toxic substances around, and the Air Resources Board has made a finding that says that there is no safe level. So if there's a waiver that essentially involves this board waiving additional diesel, I won't be able to support it.
Okay, thank you. One last comment is be sure the district to include the prior exhibits from the 28th of September into this variance. Okay. Thank you all very much.